There is a story about ancient Scotland that almost no one tells. Not because it was hidden, not because it was forgotten, but because it did not fit the image people preferred to believe. They were not warriors choosing glory. They were not servants choosing loyalty. They were not free men choosing a path. They were something older, something stranger, something the modern world has no clean word for. And that discomfort is precisely why this story has remained in the margins for so long. We speak of Scottish castles, and we see stone towers rising from mist-covered hills. We imagine chieftains wrapped in wool, fires burning against the dark, the sound of pipes carrying across frozen lochs. It is a powerful image. It is also incomplete, because inside those walls, inside the spaces between feasting halls and sleeping quarters, between the Lord's chamber and the outer garrison, there existed a category of human being that followed its own silent logic. A logic built not from individual choice, but from the grinding machinery of clan survival, territorial power, and the particular hunger that authority generates when it has no external check. It was never about desire alone. It was about dominance. It was about display. It was about what a powerful man kept close to him and what that keeping announced to everyone watching. If you understand this, you will understand something about those castles that the stones themselves do not reveal. Before you can understand the person, you must understand the world that made them possible. Scotland, in its ancient and early medieval period, was not a nation. There was no single throne commanding loyalty from Caithness to the borders. There was no unified law written in a single book, no standing army answering to one crown. What existed instead was a patchwork of territories, each one a gravity field of obligation, blood relation, resource competition, and ritual authority. Power was local, power was personal, and power was always, in every generation, contested. The land itself enforced this reality. The climate of ancient Scotland was cold in ways that modern comfort has erased from imagination. Winters arrived early and stayed long. Frost came to the glens before harvest was finished. The hills that looked majestic from a distance were, on foot, relentless, boggy, wind-scoured, difficult to cross and more difficult to hold. Rivers flooded, passes closed. Settlements that seemed permanent were, in geological terms, temporary negotiations between human stubbornness and elemental indifference. People built accordingly. The earliest structures were roundhouses, circular walls of stone, wattle, and turf, roofed with thatch so thick it could hold the weight of a man. Smoke from the central hearth had no chimney. It rose slowly through the thatch, filling the upper space before escaping, leaving walls dark and lungs accustomed to a permanent gray haze. Animals were kept close, sometimes inside during winter months, their warmth a practical calculation, their smell inseparable from daily life. The floor was packed earth. The light was firelight. The cold pressed in from every direction. In this world, wealth was not measured in coins. Coins were rare, symbolic, foreign. Wealth was cattle. It was land. Or rather, the right to graze land, to plant it, to defend it, to pass it to your children. It was alliance. Who would fight beside you when the neighboring clan pushed across the boundary stone? It was knowledge. The druid or ritual specialist who remembered the seasonal calendar, the genealogy of every family, the terms of every agreement made 3 generations before any living person was born. Oral memory was infrastructure. Without writing, every social arrangement depended on living witnesses who could testify. Agreements were not signed. They were witnessed, sworn, sometimes sealed with symbolic exchange, a gift of cattle, a shared meal, occasionally the exchange of a person. The spoken word, delivered in the right context by the right speaker, carried the weight that a document carries in a literate society. Authority in this context belonged to those who could accumulate and hold these resources simultaneously. Land, cattle, fighting men, ritual knowledge, and the memory of legitimate precedent. The chieftain was not simply the strongest man. He was the man whose claim to leadership was recognized by enough people with enough power that challenging it cost more than accepting it. His hall was the physical center of this recognition. To eat at his table was to acknowledge his authority. To sleep under his roof was to exist within his sphere. And his sphere extended over everything inside those walls. If this kind of story makes you see the past with greater depth, consider subscribing. These scripts take time to build, and there are still many stories waiting to be told. The castle, or in earlier periods, the fortified hall, the crannog rising from a loch, the hilltop enclosure ringed with timber and stone, was not simply a residence. It was a machine for producing and displaying power. Every space inside it had social meaning. The Great Hall was public theater, where rank was enacted through position, proximity, and portion size. Who sat closest to the Lord? Who received the first cut of meat? Who was permitted to speak, and in what order? These were not casual arrangements. They were a daily performance of hierarchy, repeated until repetition became law. The private quarters existed at the center of this machine, and in the private quarters, the rules of public performance continued, because power in ancient Scotland did not stop at the threshold of the bedchamber. It passed through. To understand what a male concubine was in this world, you must first discard every association the word carries from other contexts. This was not Rome. This was not the Ottoman court. This was not a literary invention or a diplomatic category borrowed from distant civilizations. What existed in the fortified halls and stone towers of ancient Scotland was something that grew from the specific soil of that society, from its particular logic of alliance, obligation, display, and the absolute authority of the Lord within his own walls. The word concubine, applied here, is an approximation. The Gaelic and Brythonic languages of ancient Scotland did not produce a single clean term for this arrangement because the arrangement itself was not a fixed legal category. It was a practice, a recurring solution to recurring pressures. And like most practices that persist across generations without being written down, it survived because it served the system, not because it served the individual caught inside it. Begin with the structure. In a society organized by clan and kinship, every human body had social value beyond its individual capacity to work or fight. Bodies were currency in the economy of alliance. Daughters were given in marriage to seal agreements between rival families. Sons were sent as hostages to powerful lords to guarantee their father's loyalty. Younger children of lesser branches, those with no inheritance to claim, no strategic marriage to offer, no land to anchor them to a specific future, existed in a condition of ambient obligation. They belonged to the family, but the family had no fixed plan for them. They were assets awaiting deployment. In this environment, a powerful chieftain maintaining a household of dependents was not unusual. It was expected. The size and composition of a lord's household announced his capacity, his ability to feed, clothe, and command a significant number of people. A small household suggested weakness. A large household suggested resources, reach, and dominance. Every person inside those walls was, in some measure, a demonstration. Some of those people were warriors. Some were craftsmen. The blacksmith, the leather worker, the person who knew how to preserve meat through winter. Some were ritual specialists, the keepers of memory and ceremony. Some were servants in the practical sense, those who cooked, carried, cleaned, maintained the physical fabric of the Lord's existence. And some occupied a category that blurred several of these functions simultaneously, in ways that were deliberately kept ambiguous. A young man, typically between 14 and 25, typically from a family of lesser rank within the clan's wider network, typically without strong inheritance prospects, might enter the Lord's household through a series of steps that, from the outside, resembled ordinary service. He might be presented by his family as a gesture of loyalty. He might be taken following a minor conflict, as a form of tribute that stopped short of outright slavery. He might be offered specifically because he possessed a quality that the Lord valued: physical beauty, a particular skill, a voice suited to the oral performance of poetry or genealogy. The entry was rarely violent at the point of threshold. The violence was structural. It had already happened before he arrived. It happened in the moment his family's position made refusal impossible. It happened in the moment the social logic of the world he was born into determined that his body was a resource his family could not afford to waste on sentiment. Once inside the Lord's household, his position was defined by proximity. Proximity to power, in ancient Scotland, was a form of power itself. But it was borrowed power, contingent power, power that evaporated the moment the Lord withdrew his attention. The young man ate better than most people in the surrounding settlement. He slept in warmth. He wore better cloth. He was protected from the ordinary dangers that claimed the lives of people outside those walls: raiding, starvation, the casual violence of unprotected existence. But there was a problem. Everything he had because of one man's preference. And preference, in a world without written contract, without independent legal standing, without any institution that existed outside the Lord's authority, was the most unstable foundation a life could rest on. His duties were multiple and deliberately undefined. He attended the Lord in public, standing nearby during feasts, accompanying him on journeys, present during the negotiations and ceremonies that constituted the Lord's political life. This visibility was part of the arrangement. His presence announced something about the Lord's status, that this man commanded not only warriors and craftsmen, but beauty, youth, and the loyalty of families willing to offer their sons. In private, his duties extended further. The sexual dimension of this arrangement was not incidental. It was not a corruption of an otherwise functional role. It was woven into the logic of the position from the beginning, understood by everyone involved, by the young man, by his family, by the Lord's household, by the wider clan network that observed and interpreted every detail of the Lord's domestic arrangements. This did not make it accepted in the modern sense of consensual. Acceptance in ancient Scotland meant something different. It meant that the structure had been absorbed into the ordinary furniture of life, that it recurred often enough to have its own unspoken rules, its own gradations of status, its own internal hierarchy. Because even within this position, hierarchy existed. Not all male concubines occupied the same place in the Lord's domestic order. A young man who had been in the household for several years, who had learned to navigate the Lord's moods, who had accumulated small reserves of trust and demonstrated usefulness beyond the merely physical. That person occupied a different position than one newly arrived, untested, still learning the geography of power inside those walls. What nobody expected was how durable some of these arrangements became. A lord who kept the same young man close across years was making a statement, not of sentiment in any modern sense, but of consistency, of preference stable enough to function almost like a form of recognition. In a world where recognition was the closest thing to security, this mattered. It was not love, as modernity defines it, but it was not nothing. The young man who understood this, who read the internal logic of his situation with sufficient clarity, learned to transform contingency into something slightly more durable. He learned which requests to fulfill without hesitation, which moments required careful silence, which gestures of loyalty would be remembered, and which demonstrations of personality would be tolerated or punished. He was, in this sense, not passive, but his agency was the agency of someone navigating a structure he had not chosen and could not exit. The careful, exhausting intelligence of a person who has learned to move precisely within walls that were built before he arrived. And those walls, it turned out, were not only physical. The walls of a Scottish lord's hall were made of stone and timber and packed earth. But the walls that truly confined the young man inside them were made of something harder to see and infinitely more difficult to escape. They were made of obligation. Not obligation in the abstract philosophical sense. Obligation in the specific, material, daily sense of a world where every relationship carried weight, every exchange created debt, and every act of receiving, food, warmth, protection, proximity to power, added another layer to an architecture of indebtedness that accumulated silently year by year until the idea of departure became not merely difficult, but structurally incoherent. To leave was not simply to walk out a door. To leave was to unmake every arrangement that had placed you there. It was to repudiate the family that had offered you. It was to insult the Lord who had accepted you. It was to step outside the network of obligation and protection that stood between you and the raw exposure of unaffiliated existence in a landscape where unaffiliated people did not survive long. There was no road that led away from this that did not lead directly into a worse version of it. This is the mechanism that the stones do not show. Not the physical captivity, though that existed too, in various degrees depending on the Lord and the moment. The deeper captivity was social. It was the captivity of a person who understood with complete clarity that every alternative to his current position was worse than the position itself. Understanding this changes how you read the behavior of young men in this situation. The ones who lasted, who moved through years inside the Lord's household without being discarded, punished, or sold into outright slavery when they lost favor, were not simply lucky. They were skilled. They had developed a form of intelligence that the ancient world required of anyone navigating power from a position of structural vulnerability. The ability to read the room, to anticipate need, to make themselves useful in ways that extended beyond the original terms of their presence. Some became genuinely valuable as political assets. A young man who had spent years attending the Lord during negotiations absorbed information. He heard conversations that were not meant to be analyzed, witnessed agreements made and broken, learned the names and weaknesses and ambitions of every family in the clan network. This knowledge, carefully held and never carelessly deployed, became its own form of currency. Some lords recognized this and used it deliberately. The young man who stood near the Lord's chair during a negotiation was not only decorative, he was a witness. His presence sometimes served a function similar to that of the oral memory specialist, not as a formal keeper of records, but as a living repository of observed fact that the Lord could access privately, away from the formalities of the hall. This gave some male concubines a peculiar kind of influence. Not power, never power, because power required the ability to act independently, and independence was precisely what the structure denied them. But influence, the capacity to shape decisions at the margins, to whisper something into the Lord's awareness at a moment when it might redirect an outcome. The system had a cost, however, that ran in both directions. For the young man, the cost was existential and unrelenting. He lived in a condition of permanent contingency. His position depended entirely on the continuation of the Lord's preference, which could shift for reasons entirely outside his control. A new alliance that required a new gesture of incorporation, a political calculation that made his presence inconvenient, the simple fact of aging in a role that valued youth. When preference shifted, the protections it had provided shifted with it. There was no severance, no formal recognition of years served, no institutional memory that preserved his status beyond the Lord's attention. What looked like security concealed something else entirely. A young man who had spent 5 or 6 years in the Lord's household, who had arranged his entire understanding of safety and survival around the structures of that household, was, in practical terms, less capable of independent survival than he had been when he arrived. The skills required to survive outside those walls, the agricultural knowledge, the fighting capacity, the network of family obligation and reciprocal labor that sustained ordinary clan life, had atrophied. He had become specialized for an environment that was entirely contingent on one man's continued goodwill. This was not accidental. The gradual erosion of external options was a feature of the arrangement, not a flaw. A dependent who had nowhere else to go was a more reliable dependent than one who maintained viable alternatives. For the Lord, the cost was different, but equally real. Maintaining a household that included male concubines was an exercise in managing a specific form of political visibility. In a world without privacy in any modern sense, where the Lord's hall was always inhabited, always observed, where every domestic arrangement was available for interpretation by clan members, rivals, allies, and enemies, the composition of the household was a constant political statement. A lord whose domestic arrangements were seen as excessive, as consuming resources that should flow toward warriors and political allies, risked a specific kind of criticism, not moral criticism in the contemporary sense. The ancient Scottish world did not organize its ethical framework around the same axes that modernity uses. The criticism was practical, that his judgment was distorted, that his priorities were misaligned, that his attention had turned inward toward private satisfaction at the expense of outward clan management. This criticism, if it accumulated enough weight, could erode the recognition on which his authority depended. And authority in ancient Scotland that lost recognition did not decline gradually. It collapsed suddenly, in the way that a structure maintained by consensus collapses the moment consensus withdraws. The Lord navigated this by calibration. He maintained his household at a size and composition that announced abundance without suggesting excess. He kept his domestic arrangements visible enough to project power and opaque enough to resist detailed scrutiny. The young men inside his walls were present at feasts, visible during ceremonies, occasionally referenced in the oblique language of praise poetry that described the Lord's magnificence. But they were not the subject of direct narration. They existed in the peripheral vision of the clan's social awareness, acknowledged without being named. And then, an inevitable consequence emerged from this arrangement that changed everything about how it functioned. The young man who had been present long enough, who had accumulated enough observed knowledge, who had made himself genuinely useful in the political operations of the household, that person became, paradoxically, a liability at precisely the moment he became most valuable. Because he knew too much. He had witnessed negotiations that could not be made public. He had heard admissions of weakness that the Lord's political performance depended on concealing. He carried in his memory a map of the Lord's private character, his fears, his calculations, his moments of uncertainty. That was entirely incompatible with the performed confidence that the great hall required. A young man in this position was not simply a dependent. He was an archive, and archives, in a world without written records, were dangerous in proportion to their completeness. The Lord, who recognized this, faced a choice that the structure of his own authority had made inevitable. He could continue to trust the person he had made into an archive, deepening the investment, extending the protection, hoping that the accumulated weight of years together was sufficient to guarantee silence. Or he could find a way to neutralize the archive before it could be read by anyone else. Neither option was clean. Neither option was fully within his control. And the young man at the center of this calculation had no way of knowing, from one season to the next, which direction the Lord's assessment was moving. This was the deepest wall of all. Not stone, not obligation, not the erosion of alternatives, but the permanent uncertainty of living as a necessary secret inside a system that had not yet decided whether secrets were better kept close or buried. There is a moment that must have repeated itself across generations inside those halls. Not a dramatic moment, not the kind that produces legend or enters the oral record through the praise singer's performance. A quiet moment. A moment between two people in a space where the fire had burned low, and the noise of the hall had receded, and the distance between power and dependence had temporarily collapsed into something that resembled, without ever becoming, equality. In that moment, the young man knew exactly what he was, and the Lord knew exactly what he had made. And neither of them had a language for it that the world outside those walls would have recognized. This is the part of ancient Scottish history that the romanticized image cannot contain. The mist and the stone and the pipes and the fierce loyalty of the clan. These are real. They are part of the story, but they are the surfaces. Underneath them ran a different current, older and less heroic. The current of what human beings do to each other when authority is absolute, when alternatives are absent, and when the system has been running long enough that everyone inside it has forgotten that it was ever designed at all. The young man who survived his years in the Lord's household, who navigated the shifting ground of preference and political calculation and the slow erosion of his external options, emerged from that experience changed in ways the ancient world had no framework to describe and no particular interest in examining. If he was fortunate, he was eventually placed. Not freed, the concept of freedom in the modern individualist sense did not apply here, but repositioned. A lord who wished to retire a dependency gracefully might arrange a marriage into a lesser branch of the clan, a grant of grazing rights on marginal land, an assignment of duties that moved the young man from the private sphere toward the administrative periphery. This was not generosity. It was management. It removed a liability from the immediate domestic space while preserving the Lord's ability to call on the knowledge the young man carried, should the need arise. Some were placed as intermediaries, men who had spent years absorbing the Lord's political world, who had learned to read the moods and calculations of powerful people, who had developed the particular intelligence of the structurally vulnerable. These men were sometimes extraordinarily useful as go-betweens, as quiet negotiators, as the people sent to communicate things that could not be said in the formal registers of the hall. They moved through the clan's political landscape in the spaces between official positions, carrying information and managing relationships in ways that required precisely the skills their experience had forced them to develop. This was not redemption. It was the system finding another use for a resource it had already extensively used. For those who were not placed gracefully, whose lord lost power, died suddenly, was defeated by a rival clan, the end of the arrangement arrived without preparation and without support. The protections that had structured their entire adult existence dissolved overnight. The household scattered. The hall passed to new hands or was burned. And the young man, no longer young, carrying skills calibrated for an environment that no longer existed, attached to a network of obligation that had just been severed at its root, faced the landscape of ancient Scotland without the one thing that landscape required above all others: affiliation. To be unaffiliated in this world was to be invisible in the worst sense, not the invisibility of anonymity, which carries its own freedoms, the invisibility of someone who does not appear in anyone's calculation of obligation, who has no claim on anyone's surplus, no right to anyone's protection, no position in the hierarchy of any hall. Some found their way into monasteries as Christianity began to press its way into the Scottish landscape. Institutions that offered a different kind of structured dependency, one with its own demands and its own erasure of individual history, but also one that did not require the same calibration of a single powerful man's shifting preference. The monastery was a different machine, but it was a machine that took in people the clan structure had finished with. Some disappeared into the margins of settlements, surviving through the accumulated small skills of people who have learned to make themselves useful to whoever holds temporary power in their immediate vicinity. Some, carrying the political knowledge of years spent at the center of clan operations, became genuinely dangerous to the lords who had used them, not through any deliberate act of vengeance, but simply because they existed, remembered things, and might one day find themselves in the presence of someone who would find those memories valuable. What looked like a private domestic arrangement concealed, at its edges, a structural instability that the lords who maintained these households were always managing and never fully resolving. And here is what the ruins do not tell you, but what the logic of the system insists upon. The young men who passed through these arrangements were not exceptional. They were not aberrations produced by particularly cruel lords or unusually desperate families. They were the ordinary output of a system operating exactly as it was designed to operate. The clan structure of ancient Scotland was not designed around the well-being of its most vulnerable members. It was designed around survival, collective survival, the survival of the group across generations, across bad winters and rival raids, and the constant pressure of a landscape that did not forgive miscalculation. Within that imperative, individual bodies were assets to be deployed with the same pragmatic calculation applied to cattle and land and alliance. This is not a condemnation of ancient Scottish society. It is a description of what any society looks like when survival is not guaranteed, when resources are tight, when authority is personal rather than institutional, and when the structures that protect individuals from the appetites of the powerful have not yet been built. Every society builds those structures slowly, imperfectly, always in response to the specific pressures of its moment. Ancient Scotland had not built them yet. It was still operating in the older grammar, the grammar of collective need overriding individual claim, of power expressing itself through the bodies of those who could not refuse, of the household as a space where the Lord's authority was absolute, and the distance between service and possession was a matter of degree rather than kind. What is remarkable is not that this happened. What is remarkable is how long it took, in Scotland, as everywhere, for the structures to shift. How many generations passed through arrangements like this one before the accumulation of resistance, of institutional memory, of written law, and external accountability made them impossible to sustain in their original form? And even then, even after the structures shifted, even after the written law arrived and the church imposed its particular version of moral order, and the clan system gradually dissolved into something more recognizable as a modern state, even then, the underlying grammar persisted, in different forms, in different registers, In the spaces between official arrangements, where power and vulnerability continued to find each other with the same ancient efficiency, because the system was never only Scottish, and it was never only ancient, it was the recurring solution that authority generates when it has no external check, the recurring arrangement between those who hold power and those who have no viable alternative to proximity to it. The recurring logic of a world where belonging to the right person is safer than belonging to yourself. The stones of those castles still stand in certain places, reduced to foundations, to broken towers, to the outline of walls that once enclosed everything we have been describing. Tourists walk through them and imagine warriors and feasts and the romantic violence of clan warfare. They are not wrong. Those things were there, but so was this. So was the fire burning low in the private chamber. So was the young man learning to read the silence. So was the Lord calculating, always calculating, what to do with the archive he had made. So was the morning that arrived without explanation, and the changed arrangement that no one would record, and the absence that the oral tradition would not find worth preserving. History remembers what power once remembered. The rest persists in the logic of the system itself, invisible, durable, waiting for someone to read the structure rather than the surface. The stones have been standing for 1,000 years. They are still waiting.